Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Data Storytelling, Narrative Strategies and Structures. My name is Ron Tang. I'm an associate professor at School of Library and Information Science, Simmons College. Before we get started, so I'm the moderator for this session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined in lesson-only mode, meaning your line has been muted, but you'll find other ways to communicate with us in the control panel. You can communicate with us and other attendees through the chat pane. You can post questions for the presenters at any time during the presentation by typing in the question pane. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Kate McDowell, Associate Professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Professor McDowell has been teaching storytelling since 2007, helping graduate professional students explore how their stories can help them succeed. She is also the storytelling consultant to campus level and advancement of University of Illinois. Her workshops for nonprofit bring together the tools of storytelling with many areas, including fundraising, career preparation, business, and public service. Her current research project is on storytelling at work. And she is, in fact, she actually mentioned to me just now, she's finished her third chapter. She's working on a book called Storytelling Thinking for Professionals. So without further ado, Kate, you can take over.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here today. So when we talk about data storytelling, the way that I talk about it has a strong emphasis on the storytelling. I work with a data visualization specialist, but that's not my area. My area is really the narrative aspects of what we need to do with data, what we need to do to make what we know about our organizations, our accomplishments, anything where we're collecting data, how to make that comprehensible to I really focus on everyday people, especially professionals, as you heard about the Storytelling Thinking for Professionals book. So today's plan has 4 parts. The first one will be doing some definitions of how I see storytelling as well as case studies. I hope those definitions will intersect productively with definitions you might have from being in the field of library and information science, or if you're new to the field, becoming familiar with that field that has a 100-year tradition and more of storytelling as a way of reaching audiences in libraries. So I'll talk about my definition of storytelling and a few case studies. We'll also have a poll in there to find out if you as participants tend to be more familiar with data or tends to be more familiar with story. So we'll do that in a bit. The second part, I'll talk about strategies. How do you develop data stories? The easiest way to talk about that is to start with talking about what's easier to tell, what's harder to tell, what are the chronological and logical structures of narrative, and how do you dig in to develop a great middle of a story. Finally, we'll land with some structures. These are narrative structures that I'm borrowing from other narrative theorists, but I've been refining them over the last couple of years, doing workshops not unlike this one, usually more interactive, but those structures are meant to be tools that you can take away and think about whether stories that you have to tell might fit in whole or in part with some of those structures. I don't think narrative structures are the end-all be-all. Stories are not a plug-and-play mode, and neither is data storytelling something that you can do in the abstract. It all depends on your context. So everything that I say will be based in case studies and grounded in particular contexts, and with hope, what I hope to do is inspire you, especially in part 4, the coda, to think about what it means to tell stories by heart and the wisdom that we have in the tradition of librarianship that does apply, I think, directly to data storytelling. So first of all, as you're listening today, I'm going to suggest that you think about one story that you would like to be able to tell more effectively. One story related to your professional work. Maybe it's an organization story, maybe it's a story of something you're accomplishing with students or in your educational processes or practices, maybe it's a story of your research that you'd like to tell more effectively. And I hope that that will help frame how you hear what you hear today, and I would also welcome questions about particular applications when we get to the end. So I've done a lot of consulting. Here are some organizations I've worked with for a long time in various ways. The Urbana Free Library, ALA is more recent for me, but I've been serving on external review panels, and my school is the School of Information Sciences at Illinois, and another library. And I won't go through all of these, but I've also done a lot of consulting work the last 4 years. And this is just a sampling of the organizations I've worked with that are focused on nonprofit applications of storytelling. So these organizations have had all different kinds of data, but they all know that they need to use something about storytelling. They all know storytelling is important. If nothing else, they've heard it as a buzzword. But I think people know storytelling is important because they intuit some of these findings that have been pretty robustly verified at this point. You know that I am not a neurologist. My PhD is in library and information science, like many of yours, I'm sure. But it's very clear that things like neural coupling and mirroring occur when storytelling is happening, by which I mean there is a live exchange of story between a teller and an audience, however big or small that audience. So there's a teller and an audience and a story that emerges. Over on the other side, you can notice that there's dopamine, as in we like stories, and also our cortex activity with a lot of what we do. But at any rate, there's cortex activity that seems to be some of it specific to how storytelling activates the brain. I'm not a brain expert, but I am working on developing this area. I'm working on this book that I'm calling Storytelling Thinking. The idea here is that what we know about storytelling, this triangle of connection between the teller, the audience, and the story, each of them changing and dynamic in this process, by the way, and there's one whole chapter that I won't go into today about this actually being a 6-part process, because this represents 3 entities and 3 relationships, to borrow from database language, that have particular functions and structures between them. But the teller tells the story to an audience. The audience hears what the teller is telling, but you know, of course, because you know something about storytelling, that what the teller is telling and what the audience hears is not always exactly the same thing. The audience has their own connection to the story. And most importantly, for storytelling at work, the kinds of work I've been doing the last couple of years, this triangle can rotate. So the roles can change. It's important to me that the teller can become the audience member just by changing things, by asking a question. The audience can become the teller by being invited to say something about what they know. And in that way, there's a process of story that emerges that is not just one story that a teller has composed or memorized, I hope not, but possibly memorized or prepared off by themselves, kind of rehearsing in an office before they ever see an audience. But that actually the process of storytelling is the process of the live interchange. Story is one part of that live interchange. It is impacted by the interchange. It is the reason for the interchange. It is what emerges in the moment, and to some extent the mutual meaning that emerges around a story that a teller and audience both hear and participate in, that is also the outcome of a storytelling exchange. So before I go any further, since this is about data storytelling, I want to ask just briefly for you to pick one or the other of these comfort levels. We have a two-part poll, and what I would say is if you have comfort in both areas and want to describe that in the chat, or comfort in neither area, you could describe that in the chat. But if you would very quickly answer this poll, which are you more familiar with? Either data or story? Just give that a couple of seconds. Most of you know fairly quickly what you're more familiar with, what you're more comfortable with. Great. I'm seeing responses being collected. It's looking really interesting. Right now it's at half and half. Fascinating. If it stays at about half and half, I can tell you that when we first taught this class, Dr. Matt Turk and I co-teach the data science storytelling course. When we first taught this class last year, and I asked this question at the first day of the class, I got exactly a 50-50 split of the students in the room. They come from library and information science. They also come from our information management program, a few doctoral students. But the students in the room were half and half, data and story, and it looks like you guys are at about the same place. Okay, so here's our what did we find slide. Oopsie. See, there we go. That's so we know what we found, which is close to half and half in terms of data and story. So what I'm going to do today is try, knowing that, I'm going to try to give examples that span across that. But notice in part that most people do have a tendency in terms of which they're most familiar with. And ideally, like Dr. Matt Turk and I teaching this data science storytelling course, ideally you bring people together who have strengths in each of these areas and learn to listen well enough that you can actually synthesize a story that works well from a narrative perspective and works well from a data accuracy and translation and communication perspective. So before we go deeper, I do need to pause and have a moment for ethics. This is a very rough kind of guideline that I give whenever I'm talking about storytelling with people, and that is that I in my world, working with storytelling thinking for professionals, there are three categories of ownership of story that really matter to me. The first is a person's story, so people's stories meaning really a person. And in that case, you can ask a particular individual person for permission. You can imagine a student who did really well in one of your classes. Maybe you want to share their assignment with the following class. You ask them for permission. That assignment is analogous to their story. But sometimes it's really a story of what they did. A culture's stories are by far the most complex, and I should say some stories are owned not just by one culture but by multiple cultures. Some stories are owned by multiple cultures but seen in different ways depending on which cultural perspective you come from. Stories can also vary in terms of what they mean if you are in a culture, if you are on the edge between two cultures, and where you are culturally. Some of you are much deeper experts than I am in ideas like positionality. Where you are culturally may also vary somewhat from context to context. So what I like to say is the ideas about ownership around a culture's stories are precisely as complex as the entire world of cultures and stories. So I can't give you one rule here today, but I can tell you that ethically, if someone should say to you, that was not your story to tell, you should not have told that story, you have violated a norm, or you have broken my expectations, and they tell you that, your best bet for ethical behavior and intercultural communication is to say, thank you so much for telling me, please tell me more. They may or may not tell you more, that's fine. You get a lot of information from that. The institution stories are the third category. They're there because if a person's stories is easy to say who owns them, and a culture stories it's almost impossible to say who owns them. And institution stories exist about in the middle of that spectrum. They are not an individual person's story. Even the very top president, dean, CEO of an organization would not be said to own all of the stories of the organization, and neither are they entirely individual. So finding a way to think about institutional ownership of story for me means making sure that your stories go through a storytelling process. I'd be willing to bet that most of you are thinking about storytelling and data storytelling in particular in relation to institutional processes. So let me give you a couple examples of institutional processes so that you can think about that with me. A few years back, we were talking about major reorganizations to our library stacks, and thank goodness this is not a picture of those stacks, just to be clear. This is terribly organized. But we were talking about this, and one thing that came up in this large sort of town hall-like forum was the idea that it's not always clear who speaks for the stacks. Sometimes the collections that we have, and I would say this actually, if you think about the stacks as physical collections, I think this also applies to data collections. It's not always clear who speaks for the data that we have, the data that we collect. So I worked quite a bit with Prairie Rivers Network and a number of other nonprofits that you saw before to try, and this was the outcome of that work that's still in publication process, but what I found were that it was pretty easy to categorize nonprofit stories into the ones that are typically told, the first three, origin, major growth, mission accomplished kinds of stories, and the ones that are not typically told. So the reason this is called untold nonprofit stories is I want to draw your attention to those bottom three stories and think about the kinds of data that could be involved in generating things that will help tell an untold story. For Prairie Rivers Network, that's involved in water conservation, I did an in-depth year-long consulting project with them around their 50th anniversary. And they have been coming up with new ways of telling the story visually. This is a sort of visual model of a story, of what is behind the scenes? What's at stake when we talk about water quality, and what are the processes that make water quality be what it is at any level that it happens to be? They also have started, and this was since the consulting work we did, trying some new ways of telling river stories, ways that push back against the idea that all rivers can be engineered, which is a challenging concept for folks who have been successfully engineering rivers in various ways. So the data that they have may be very, very highly scientific, and it is, but the work that we did was about how would they take the things that might motivate people to improve water quality and tell those stories in a different way. So here's an example of their new way of telling some of these stories. And you can look for more information about this if you'd like. They're easy to find online. I mentioned, well, Rong mentioned, and thank you for the introduction, Rong, I should have said, that I've worked with advancement, I've worked with fundraising, and I've done a number of different leadership development workshops and storytelling coaching seminars, at least 2 or 3 a year for the last 4 years with our teams of different sizes at our campus and beyond, actually all 3 campuses of the University of Illinois. We talk about ethics, which you've gotten a basic overview of. We talk about what can you ask and what can you tell. Often people thinking about representing an organization will think that they have to come with stories prepared, and they do. You do have to do that, but it's also important to think about the storytelling triangle and what can you ask. And then listening for meaning. What is that meaning that emerges between a potential donor's interests and the interests of the university, and how might that be an emergent story? Campus Advancement has actually hired someone to do storytelling themselves, and they've done some new ways of visualizing their progress toward fundraising goals. So this is kind of interesting to think about. And that brings me to the first question I want us to just think together a little bit about, which is that before you get into what data you have and what stories you need to tell, the first, in some ways, the first step is to ask who is serving as the storyteller. It's important to think about who tells your stories and what roles they have in the organization and what obstacles there are to those telling your stories, so that what obstacles are there to them telling those stories effectively. I bring this up because often when we're talking about data storytelling, what's really happening, and this to some extent was indicated by the poll we did earlier, is that some people have the data and some people have the storytelling job, and those people are not necessarily in contact, much less in a rich storytelling exchange where they could, put together a story that emerges between the dynamic process of their communication, right? I mean, that's optimistic sometimes. At other times, you have great communication inside the organization, but maybe in that case, sometimes people forget to tell the stories outside because things are going so well internally. So one of the first things you can do to analyze how your organization could do data storytelling better is to really think about who is serving as storyteller. This idea of who tells your stories may seem really simple, but let me break it down just a bit for you with a couple of visual metaphors and analogies, ways of seeing this. So the first one, here's some data and here's the storyteller. And you know that works really well in plenty of cases, but let's face it, if you're the person who collected the data, it may be hard for you to choose how much or how little to share. A classic problem in data storytelling is overdoing the setting. And it needs to be really clean and clear if people are able to not just tell the story, but also retell the story. What we hope is that our data will inform a great teller who can tell our story. And what we fear is that they change it so much along the process of that telling that it's not recognizable at the end. So the vehicle of the story becomes incredibly important in this. Our real goal, I would say, is not necessarily just the translation of data accurately through story, but it's also the translation of data accurately enough and compellingly enough through story so that you can influence someone else. So I want to tell you a story really quickly. It's a short story, and we'll think about it a little bit together. It's a classic one from business context. I've heard it in multiple different kinds of business organization spaces that have embraced storytelling, but less in our field. At the end of a long day at sea, there was a captain who saw ahead of him lights that should not be where they were, and he sent out a signal, and he said, "We are a ship coming your direction. Please move left 20 degrees. And a signal came back, "You move left 20 degrees. Well, the captain was flummoxed by this and flustered and wasn't sure what to do, so he sent another signal and he said, "We are heading your direction. please move left 20 degrees, and the signal came back, you move left 20 degrees. Well, finally, the captain was feeling some desperation, and so sent out a wordier message than before, saying, I am a large ship. We are on course to intersect with you. We do not want to collide. Please move left 20 degrees. And the message came back, I am a lighthouse. So there are lots of times when we just don't quite have the information we need yet in a story. Here's a way to think about this. What's the information problem in this story? Think about that having to do with location or geography, but there might be other answers too. Which data does the story include? There's a lot about the ship, but not a lot about the context, right? And then what's missing? And what would be the obstacles to understanding this anyhow? So what would be the ways that you could actually move forward? So this takes me to, takes me straight to strategies. Let's talk about narrative strategies. So I'm going to flash this by your eyes, but just know that there are easier and harder to tell things based on the logical structure of story. And I have a particular way of talking about logical and chronological structures of story. So just bear with me while I use the language. I'll define it in a second. It's easier if it's fewer characters, a simpler setting, a simpler plot, and one time period. It's harder if any of those things are not true. You can think about any folktale you care to name. The Gingerbread Man, Chicken Little with the Sky That's Falling, and on the right side would be Game of Thrones. So if you look at those two ideas, or Song of Ice and Fire, depending on how you prefer that narrative. So most of you are likely have at least at some point seen something like this, which is a story arc. I like to call this the chronological structure of narrative. And a lot of people will start here when they think they're going to develop a story. This is kind of the image they have in mind. It's this exciting beginning, and then a struggle, and a turning point, and then a resolution. And the issue with this is that this is a really complex structure. The yellow dots show the increase of both information and emotional tension over time. And it can be difficult to develop a story with just this. So I like to think about that we have other tools as well. We have the logical structures of stories. We have character and the idea of transformation. We have setting, facts, context. Sometimes that's data-driven. I think data can be a character in a story as well, especially if that data indicates a transformation either of itself or of a context or of an organization. We have plot, which is usually plausible causality. I say plausible because it's not exactly causality. I actually think plot operates on a continuum between correlation and causality, which is a little bit different. And I think that my theory is that that's part of why story works, but I haven't proved that yet or figured out how to. We have enigmas, suspense, questions, and we have information, answers. And I'll get back to some of these ideas as I give you the last narrative structures that I want you to get. But let's stay with strategies for the moment. So these are ways to break down any context and make it into a story. Let's really make it simple. Let's just cut to the middle. The middle of a story, usually called the rising action, is where the most important actions of the story take place. They are how you know what to pay attention to. Because let's face it, we've all seen stories where one character is introduced, but it turns out that another one is really the most important character in the story as you go along. I like to frame this a little bit differently than just rising action, which is still pretty abstract, and I take it to a very concrete level, trouble to struggle. Most stories start with some kind of difficulty. Let me give you an example. There was a, let's see, gosh, there's so many examples I could give, and several of you know them really intimately, which makes it kind of awkward. I want to give a data one though, so I'm going to say there was a big change in patterns of enrollment in our online education program a few years back. We weren't sure what was causing this exactly, but we could tell that more and more students were coming just from the region and not from further away. And when we started the program, and I was there near to the beginning of the program, we'd had students from all around the world. It was amazing to teach. And so we began to struggle with that, first by looking at the data and seeing the decline. And second, by asking ourselves, well, what information do we have about how this program is serving students? So we started surveying everyone we could. This was a series of surveys that went out to alums, to current students. Some of you were involved in leading or editing those. But this was a series of surveys where we struggled with this reality, where we tried to gather more data in order to understand what the reality was. Now, I'll tell you the end of the story, because this isn't just about the trouble and the struggle, and you're going to be curious. And the end of the story is we modified our pedagogical model to still be a rich interactive experience with live sessions more or less weekly for our online courses, but to decrease the amount of physical residency required. So rather than having multiple times that people had to come back to campus, we moved to a welcome weekend model where people came to campus just once. And that combination of, I think we're very proud of that combination of high interaction experiences on a weekly basis and one high interaction experience as they start their program. So that was the outcome, but the struggle was real, as they say. And your data stories are no doubt similar in that there's some kind of trouble, and then you have to take action to struggle with what that means, and how are you going to know more, and how are you going to take the next action until you know more, and what steps does knowing more take? So metaphorically speaking, and by the way, this is a picture of a book that I would really recommend because it is a tremendously interesting exchange between two people who decided to map out their lives and data just in their conversation. When you're developing stories based on data, you have to look at both the chronological and logical story structures. So first, what happened over what period of time, but that's kind of difficult because there's a lot in any snapshot of life. I mean, the program that I was just talking about, you could say goes back from 1996 to the present. I mean, that's a long period of time, and you need to tell a short story most of the time when you're trying to create new action, create new kinds of buy-in. So you have to ask yourself, where's the action? What's changing in the data? What's happening? What changes? What level of detail do you need to tell in order to convey that? If you think of some parts, not all of your data, but some part of your data, some set of data points, usually a trend line, right? Usually something that shows change over time, operates as a kind of character in your data stories. And that character goes through some kind of the change that is on that trend line is a kind of version of that trouble to struggle, or the way that you react to that trend line is a version of trouble to struggle. Sometimes data indicates what we should do. Sometimes data indicates the success or failure of what we did. And the third point, setting establishes plot, is a very short way of saying that it's important that you not give so much setting that you drown out the plot. So setting should be as little as needed to set up the data as the character and the action of the trouble to struggle in the process of that narrative. So if we go back to strategies, so how do you put these strategies into action? Well, and I've been doing this kind of workshop for a lot of different audiences, so this is pretty general, but it's meant to be, I hope, applicable to things that you're working on right now. You have to ask yourself with data as character, what are the numbers and what are they showing? If they're not showing what you want them to show, sometimes you have to tell a future story about what it would mean if that data changed. In a sense, changing a pedagogical model to address declining enrollments is about telling a future story. And in this case, it has worked, which is great. There have been increases in enrollment in that program. So that's a really nice, now that story is in the past again. But it's you know, things being as they are, always changing. But asking yourself, how can that data operate as a character? And what do you know from what those numbers are showing? I don't take the numbers as self-evident. This is another major mistake. People will hand people these really gloriously elaborate spreadsheets and assume that they can see the same story as they see. In fact, sometimes you'll get this like, well, don't you see it? See that? It's right there. And it doesn't work for people. You have to have some sense of what the numbers are and what they are showing. Once you know that, you can work on this trouble to struggle idea. How can you make the story compelling? How can you describe this data as a character taking action? Or how can you describe your own actions in relation to this data? I give you the hardest example. Data as a character taking action can be difficult to describe. So that's where you have to work and kind of see how to put this into action. And then setting establishes plot, just enough context. Always ask yourself, what can you cut to get to the action faster? Every children's librarian knows this. This is a bedrock of the storytelling tradition in our field, that we may retell folk tales because they are in the public domain and also because they've worked for many, many audiences over time, but we always try to tell them as succinctly as possible. So here are some things you could ask yourself. And I did a version of this workshop for a user experience group in it's Library User Experience Chicago. I did a version of this workshop in May at the University of Chicago. And these are the kinds of things we would now break into small groups if we had that kind of time and work on. But I want to encourage you to break into those small groups at your organizations and think about, what are you trying to solve? What's the information problem you're trying to solve? Go back for a moment to the story of the exhausted captain who does not know how to even approach what's going on in front of him as an information problem. So that's okay. You just have to focus and figure out what the information problem actually is, and then what are the data sources. What changes? What changes has changed or needs to change in this data? And then what's the shortest version? Note that you don't have to solve the information problems in order to tell the story. You can have an unsolved information problem, and in fact, I'm going to talk about narrative structures next, and I'll talk about what narrative structures are particularly good for unsolved information problems. But if you're trying to aim for the shortest version, then you have to answer these questions as quickly as you can. What happens? What's the struggle? What are the numbers? How are they meaningful? What context is needed and what context can be cut? The best way to develop stories is through storytelling, hands down. Everybody who's ever practiced this knows it, and there are thousands of us in the field of library and information science who've been telling stories, often to children, but there's no audience of children that doesn't involve people of all ages to some extent. Usually parents and caregivers are there as well. The way that you develop stories is by telling them. So what that means for you, putting together a couple of pieces here, if you have the context of an organizational story and the ethics of organizational storytelling, that means that you need to tell an organizational story to many different people inside the organization as part of that organization. era of continuous, rapid, transformative change, it maybe works better for parts of organizations or particular programs or particular things. The feeling of this structure is that there's a still pool, and then there's a big splash, and then there's a still pool again. So if you know that you want to have that feeling be a defining one for your data story, then this would be a structure to try to borrow. You can think about there being, this one involves an intervention, there's a disruption, there's something that changes the continuity, the big splash, right? And then things go back into a recognizable pattern. I think the reason this structure works for organizational stories is that organizational stories fundamentally are the stories of some kind of continuity. That's what they're telling, that's what they're doing. So let me go to the next structure, and some of you will know this one. Some of you will know that George Lucas based Star Wars on this one. Some of you will be familiar with Joseph Campbell, and you might even be familiar with the claims that many people have made that I would absolutely dispute, that Campbell's narrative structure is somehow universal. It definitely is not. Partly I put it second to show you that there are other narrative structures that are just as important. But the idea is that it's the transformation of an individual. This could be a data point. This could be a service. This could be a way of understanding. But the hero makes some kind of journey that involves these 4 steps. There's a moving out and a moving back home. And the 4 steps right now are not super important. Just know that they exist. The thing I think about this kind of narrative structure is that it can be really good when we're telling stories not about ourselves for the most part. Well, why is that? We're amazing, right? So why would we not do that? Well, Joseph Campbell's data set, his qualitative data set, was from the lives of major religious figures around the world. So Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, these were the data sources for this narrative structure, and that tends to get lost. It's no wonder George Lucas used them to build a Star Wars empire, but that tends to get lost. And what happens is when we tell these kinds of stories, well, when we tell these kinds of stories about amazing people who've done incredible things, you get the feeling that they can just fly. This is a really nice kind of story to tell about people that our organization has served, about graduates of our programs, about people who have gone on to accomplish amazing things. In that case, our organizations are not the heroes, we are the helpers. Often we are actually in the helper role. And I have an article coming out about this with, it's called CASE, it's Currents Magazine, which is the national magazine for campus level advancement. So the problem with the hero's journey is that if you can't fly, you seem kind of like a jerk when you tell this sort of story. And so it's very important that this supposedly universal structure be used actually pretty selectively to talk about people who've done amazing things, usually not ourselves, who can help to put things forward. And I will say that this idea of this way of framing the hero's journey also comes directly out of the tradition of storytelling and librarianship, because we have always been taught in librarianship, if you've taken a storytelling course, that the story is more important than the teller, that we should be humble in relation to that story. And I think we should. The third structure I want to introduce is that of the Enigma code. This is kind of a way of visualizing what I mean to say here is there's an ongoing process. There's a repetitive sequence. DNA is maybe not the perfect metaphor, but it's a metaphor. The idea is that there are some kind of questions that are raised and some kind of answers that are given. But the questions are in the form of clues or suspense or something that leads your audience to wonder. And the answers that are given are explanations or resolutions. The feeling is like that of a detective story. So this is a really effective kind of story to tell when you don't exactly know where ultimately everything that you're investigating and understanding is going. A lot of research papers use this as the basic structure. If you look at them and try to infer some kind of story from research papers, they often use this as the structure because it's a process of discovery. You can think of the light being shown as one of inquiry, and then this uncertainty and data, question and information, mystery and solution. I use certain examples a lot, so I'm trying to see if maybe I could use a different one this time, but I will say, data feeds into decision-making processes in more or less these ways. At some point, you're not sure about what your next move should be, and we look at the people involved, we look at the information we have, and we look at the data about our organizations to try to see what we should do next. Maybe we decide we should launch a new degree program, for example. That's something that happened here recently and will happen again. And And the uncertainty of that becomes more certainty as we gather data about what the needs are for that kind of degree program in our state and in our region. As a public university, that's important. We raise questions about, well, what would this program consist of? How would we teach, say, a new information management degree program at the master's level? And we gather information from each other as faculty in order to try to understand that process. The great mystery of how do you start a new degree program comes down to a kind of solution, at least for the moment, of we have a new degree program now with 4 tracks, and we're still learning things from the varying popularities of those tracks. It's not done. One of the things I love about the Enigma code, which comes straight out of Roland Barthes' work, if you're interested in that, is that it really values the idea of suspense and of exploration, and this has extremely valuable real-world applications in my experience. Most things like your challenge with the data story, with this kind of data story structure, is with the previous 2 structures, there's a very clear beginning, middle, and end. This story structure is all about the middle. So you have to make sure you identify your own beginning, middle, and end in this detective feeling kind of story, this enigma story. So here they are again, just in case you want to remember: the equilibrium, the hero's journey, the flashlight, the enigma story. And I want to pause and say why this is all important. I think this is important because we want to be telling stories that last. Stories don't stay the same, and the way that they change is in the brains of the people who hear our stories and how they are listening and what they choose to retell about what we tell them. The stories of our programs, of our schools, of our research, of our findings, of anything that we accomplish really in a work context exist and last because they are retold. So I don't really expect most of the things that I do to be the subject of epic sagas down the road, but I think if we can have that high goal in mind, if we aim for that story that will just last, what fascinates me are stories that have lasted hundreds and thousands of years for just that reason. There is some wisdom in librarianship, particularly, that I think translates directly into information sciences, data science, all kinds of things. And it's based on the longevity of storytelling practice in LIS. I said 100 years, but it's really more. It's more like 130 years of storytelling. And I wrote an article about this recently in the Journal of New Librarianship. But as I looked back through the history of the practice, I found 3 sets of paradoxes that to me seem to help define what it means to do storytelling in professional contexts. Enchantment and rigor is the first paradox. People have to be really interested in the story, enchantment, engaged, somehow engrossed in that story. And then people also have to be rigorous about the data that they represent, the accuracy of the story, holding on to a clear plot thread, character setting and plot. We need planning and we need flexibility. This is true for any storytelling situation. You will learn so much if you take your spreadsheet out there into the world and try to tell its story. The best thing that can happen to you is people look at you with puzzled expressions, and you have to be flexible in order to meet them where they are. And you learn so much about how to tell that story from that experience. That is the storytelling process at work. And then also, finally, aesthetic power and humility. The idea that the story is more important than we are, but also a fundamental respect for how powerful stories really are. I don't know if you've ever watched gossip or rumors take hold in an organization or a family, but they are difficult things to root out. There's a lot of power that story has. When you're using storytelling, the one thing I would challenge you to do, and I guess I would say this is especially for my folks who are more immersed in data and for whom this presentation is really about thinking about what are the storytelling strategies that can help you approach data. And that is telling it by heart. That is taking the leap of faith that it requires to go ahead and tell a story from your memory without some kind of memorization process, bringing it to life anew for the audience before you. It will be imperfect. It will not be as perfect as any spreadsheet, but it will also connect more richly and more deeply with any live audience that you have. That is really what I have for you today. I had mentioned my Twitter handle, Kate at Kate Narrative. This is my email and final slide. And I would love to turn over to take some questions. And as we do, I think I will switch back to that initial slide of the triangle that shows storytelling as a process, because I'd love to see if we can relate the things that come up for you as questions to that process. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. We don't have any question that was submitted during the presentation, but at this moment, please, you can still submit your question through the control panel. There's a questions pane in your attendees control panel. So please feel free to submit at this point. Any questions for Kate?
We have a little over 10 minutes, and I'd be happy to be more specific about different kinds of ways of working with narrative ideas and data, especially if there's specific applications people are interested in. That's the kind of research I'm interested in doing, is something that takes conceptual work back to the practical spaces that we occupy when we're making everyday decisions.
Kate, I actually have a question for you while we're waiting for people typing. I'm hoping everyone's typing right now. So I really felt this is a fascinating talk. And before I didn't know all kinds of, story structure, and I didn't know the paradox between the enchantment requirement and also the rigorous part of the requirement. But my question is, in the past, I've never really connected data with storytelling. When we are talking about data, I'm approaching it more from the point of view of research data. Mm-hmm. So I was just thinking about how to use what you have talked about in terms of structure and strategy of storytelling to actually help to interpret research data that you have collected. For you, it looks like it's more of after you already discover things from your data, you can do storytelling. I just wonder how can you use it as an inquiry strategies, very similar to qualitative research process. I know qualitative research involves narrative inquiry, but I'm talking about, it could be quantitative data. And then you're trying to figure out the patterns in the data, and how can you use the storytelling structure and strategy to actually help you to make sense of the data you have there? Mm-hmm. Sure. We're all guided by research questions.
I'd be happy to take some of that on. So first of all, we already do this in our field and in all academic fields. It's called peer review. So the process of trying to tell the story of what we've learned and getting feedback from an audience is built in to how we work. But more specifically, I think that one way that I frame this is, the question becomes, how much do you understand your data if you can't tell its story? So there's another question I just saw, specific selection of data can be hard, and tips. And so right. Let me take it this way and just know I also do, a lot of this emerges from a combination of practice and qualitative research, but a lot of you are going to be, experts in your forms of research, and especially in quantitative research, much more than I am. But I do think that things like selecting what you're going to tell depends. We have a tendency, especially in organizations, and I would say as researchers, to try to collect a lot. We think that if we have a high volume of information, we will get better insights. And of course, in some cases, that's the case. We're looking for generalizability and things like that. Sometimes we don't think about when we're collecting what we're collecting, how is it that we're going to connect that with audiences? So I actually, in other workshops, I talk about those being two steps. There's collecting the information, and then there's making it connect. So what you're talking about, insights in the data, have you ever talked over your research with someone else before you're sure what it means? That's this process at work. It's okay. When you're uncertain yet about what it means, then you talk it over. You and I both know there are other ways to get to better insights about data that include things around visualization. I'm not a data visualization specialist or expert. I'm a narrative specialist and expert. That's what I know. And what I can say is that it does vary from person to person, but if you have data and you're unsure of what it means, chances are good you already do this. You probably talk to someone else about what you think it might mean and ask for their opinion about it. What I do with these workshops is a little more applicable to the research process of an organization of people making decisions based on data than it is to the research process of people making completely new discoveries based on data. It's just a little bit more applicable to that, I would say, which is part of why I don't know that storytelling has all of the answers for how to have insights into data, but I do think storytelling has a huge amount to offer in terms of how you think about story being a process, being a product of a process rather than just writing something up, right? Yeah. Specific selection of data. Anthony asked this, and I want to jump to that because I have something to say about that that has to do with, again, with based on my work as a consultant with organizations, the idea of story before storage. This also applies to researchers, but a lot of times we will collect things because we can collect things. And we think of the end process of the collection of data being the analysis, maybe writing it up, but not necessarily being what decision will we make next based on that data. It could be as simple as what next research project are you going to take up based on what you find in the last research project. But we don't always think about there being a story in that. And yet, if you think about people who need to understand how to do research, like doctoral students, the story of how you got from research project to research project could be very, very important. So I like to say story before storage, right? The idea here is that you make sure that you tell the story either in publication or in teaching or in a combination of both, ideally, before you just gather the data and put it away. You would be shocked at how many nonprofit organizations gather tons of data that they then store diligently without ever having had any of it inform a story. Let's take a specific example. Let's say you are collecting data from the users of a service. Okay, so this is very pertinent to a lot of people in our field, right? We are interested in use and users. Let's say you're collecting data from users of a service, and part of what you need to know from them is how they use the service, what they see now, what they would like to see. You know, there's some idea that you want to know their information behavior, of course, but you also might want to change the service itself in order to match what they're doing better. Well, a best practice that I actually learned from a previous time as Assistant Dean for Student Affairs, from a Student Affairs conference on assessment, is to make sure that people from whom you collect the data, this is also, by the way, a good ethical qualitative practice, people from whom you collect the data know or have access to the story that you're telling and know what decisions you're making based on what you collected from them. So sometimes this happens very naturally, sometimes this is a little bit more awkward, but imagine that I'm a student and there are services aimed to bring me into, let's say, use the library, and I fill out a survey, and maybe I fill out a survey, and I know that I'm going to get an entry into a drawing for our gift certificate. Well, I would say that it would be an interesting thing to, after the survey, not just thank people for it, but also loop back around and tell them where that information went. What did you do with the information you collected from them? Sometimes the best outcome is a publication that shows here's the way that informed new thinking. Other times the best outcome is actually a change in your own practice. And I think we could benefit a lot from being more honest and open and clear about when what we learn actually impacts how we practice. One of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou is, "When you know better, you do better." And I think it applies in all kinds of work, actually, but certainly in terms of thinking more broadly about how people can be drawn into the work of an organization.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
Thanks, Anthony.
So Leanne Bowler is asking a question. So,
oh, great.
Really great presentation. Thank you. I'm interested to learn more about how you structured your inquiry into the enrollment problem at Illinois and the subsequent curriculum redesign around storytelling. Can you talk about that more?
Sure. So let me be perfectly honest and say, I will say that is a metaphor I came up with later, as opposed to it being the process. It's a bit different. The things we've done internally were a little bit different, although yeah, it's a bit different. It's not like I was operating as a consultant to our own school, although I was trying to collect data from students in that context. So, so I would say the way that that process emerged had everything to do with figuring out, it's between the teller and the audience, right? So if the school is the storyteller and the students are the audience, we had to come up with some initial sense of what were the variations in the story that were possible. So for example, we knew that something was driving a decrease in enrollments, and we suspected that it had to do with the level of interaction required from our online model. And for those of you not familiar, the level of interaction was both live sessions for every class every week and an entire in-person coming to campus full 8-hour day once a semester for every class. So that was a great model. It was a really, I mean, I don't know of a better pedagogical model in terms of quality, to be honest. I still think it's probably the best, maybe the best the world has ever seen and ever will see in online education. But we had problems in terms of scale as it became a popular model. So as the tellers, as the organization, we had to think about our audience, the students. This is sort of the first metaphor, to think, what is it that we need, that they might need from us? An example of something that I found in my assistant dean for student affairs role was that students were asking for emergency funding to make those trips to campus. Well, that's really interesting because it started to show up a systemic problem, which was that student loans don't cover trips to campus. Even if the program requires it, they just don't. So then we had to flip it, right? Then we had to say, okay, we've been the storytellers and the students have been the audience. Then we had to ask the students to tell us their story. So once we knew the range of things we could probably provide, like the general outlines of a possible story of what might come next, then we asked some very broad questions of students. And I wish I had those surveys right before me, but we asked some very broad questions like, how willing are you to travel to campus? How able are you to travel to campus? What do you value most about the online components of classes versus face-to-face components? A lot of broad inquiry so that the students could, as within the structures that we set, because we're still the organizations, the students could tell us something of their story. I think the thing that I learned from qualitative inquiry from all of this is that you never go into an interview and just say, so tell me what's on your mind. You know, you always think very carefully about how you structure those questions. And there is a component of this project that's a set of research that involves interviews of people doing work in all different kinds of sectors, as well as workshops where I collect narrative structures, which is part of how I've come to this knowing. But this isn't really a workshop about my research, oddly enough. I really wanted to make it a workshop that was applicable and provocative for people trying to do data storytelling. But I hope that gives a sense of how I see the triangle operating in these kinds of contexts, and that switching of roles between the teller and the audience, and how vital it is to let a great story emerge between you by actually hearing carefully from all people.
Thank you, Kate. That's all the time we have. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact Kate directly. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We will post today's recording in the member center of the website within, ALICE website, within 24 hours. Again, if you have any additional questions or we're not able to get to your question, you can contact Kate directly. On behalf of ALICE and our presenter, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Bye.